Hello, everybody. Welcome to an episode of David Talks. Today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about the John Wayne Gacy murders, the Ronald DeFaro Jr.'s murder, and the ghosts that are associated with it, the Greenbrier Ghost, and King Henry VIII's ghosts. Now, John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17th, 1942, to his father, and his father was very abusive towards him growing up because John would get called names by his father. His father would interrogate him. Sadly, John was also sexually molested by a family member, and this affected John very deeply. So John ended up having enough of it and ended up moving out west into Las Vegas, Nevada, where he became a mortuary assistant. During that time, he would help embalmers embalm bodies, but at the same time, towards the end of the night, John ended up, when he was alone in the embalmer room with the dead bodies, he would climb into the caskets and start caressing the bodies of these dead teenage boys. It wasn't until a couple years later he ended up meeting his first wife, and he ended up having a good relationship with his father-in-law, who was the management of KFC, and John ended up becoming ownership of that, which allowed John to also have his own personal construction business on the side. So afterwards, John was targeting the hiring mostly of teenage boys and minors to work with him, because in his mind he's thinking, okay, well, this would be a perfect spot to get them hired and also having them come over to my house. But the teenage boys that he worked with were very apprehensive of John. They kind of knew something was off, except for this one particular teenage boy that by the name of Donald Voorhees. Now, Donald Voorhees worked with John and claimed that John lured him into doing drugs and alcohol. So with that, Donald claimed that he was taken home by John and that he was sexually raped by John. After that, this affected Donald very deeply. He kept it to himself, which until March of 1968, he ended up telling his own father, and his father reported it to the police. Now, John knew that he was in deep shit because the policemen literally were after him, and they were telling him, hey, you're going to be going to court for this. John ended up paying a former KFC employee $300 to prevent Donald from testifying in court. It wasn't until after that John was put in prison for 2 years, where he was a model prisoner, doing good things for the prisoners. During his time being arrested and then put in jail, he would create miniature golf courses and also try to raise the prisoners' wages. Now, after that, John was released from prison, and he ended up having a curfew there, where he would have a curfew to stay not past 10 p.m., and John vowed to never be in prison again, which it wasn't until January 2nd, 1972. It wasn't until one day John was on a bus stop, and he met this boy by the name of Timothy, who was around 15 or 16 years old. Now, Timothy had just got finished having breakfast time with his family over the Christmas break, and he needed to go back home. And he needed a place to stay during the footleg process of going back home and hitchhiking. So John ended up luring Timothy into his house, where Timothy ended up making eggs and bacon for John while John was asleep. Timothy took a knife upstairs, consciously not realizing that he had it in his left hand, woke John up, and John, thinking that Timothy was going to kill John with a knife, started stabbing Timothy multiple times. John, not realizing that Timothy was not trying to be harmful with John and the fact that he was just waking him up to get breakfast, John realized, wow, I just killed somebody for no reason. But you know what? This is a very thrill feeling. I have to go out and kill more. Now, he ended up murdering 33 victims between the years of 1972 and 1978. There was one particular survivor by the name of Jeffrey Rignall, and Jeffrey met John in his black 70s Buick. Now, John and Jeff, they were having a good conversation, and John ended up telling him, hey, you want to smoke some marijuana? I'll get you in the car. I'll take you for a ride, wherever you got to go. Jeffrey immediately agreed, and as soon as Jeffrey got in the car, John grabbed Jeff and ended up putting a rag over his nose filled with chloroform, and Jeffrey ended up passing out. Next thing you know, Jeffrey ends up in a closet with this man dressed up as a clown, showing him all these sex toys. And Jeffrey got so scared that he knew that he was in a fright for his life. Now, according to Jeffrey and John, he would sit on the victim's lap. And this was usually what he usually do. He'd like to sit on the victim's lap so they could stroke his penis. Another thing that he would also do was he would sexually try to molest Jeffrey. Now, all of a sudden, through the molestation, Jeffrey passed out again, and next thing you know, he ends up waking up in his city underneath a statue. Realizing what just happened, he ended up telling investigators, and the investigators started putting a warrant on John. But, however, John wasn't caught because he would kill more victims after that, being that Jeff was at least one of the survivors by John. So, being as it may, John would go to kids' birthday parties as Pogo the Clown. He would knock on neighbors' door as advertisements saying, vote for a candidate. He would go to bars dressed up as a clown and would get so into the murdering and luring where it just became an addiction for him. It wasn't until... Now, I'm going to show you, these are the victims that he murdered, very sadly. These are all the victims that he killed. I'm also going to show you a picture, very creepy, because he's next to a picture of, he's shaking hands with Rosalind Carter, which was Jimmy Carter's wife, who was president of the United States in the 1970s. Now, this is a picture of John shaking the first lady president, and this picture was... This is a good example of a picture because this shows you how fake somebody can be. Because actions can be hidden, but stuff can come out of the wash later on. Now, this picture was taken because John had done something with a community and doing something positive, probably with teenage boys, trying to help them get jobs and all that. He would mostly target his audience with teenage boys for some reason. So, being as it may, a couple weeks after that picture was taken, he was ended up arrested and caught for all the 33 murders that had happened. However, his last murder that he committed was on December of 1978, almost 10 years after he had done the sexual molestation of Donald. Now, it wasn't until after that happened, so one particular day, this guy by the name of Robert Peace. Now, Robert Peace was a 15-year-old who worked part-time in a pharmacy or medical facility, and Robert needed a job. He wanted more money. Now, John, of course, manipulated Robert into telling him and is saying, hey, you can make this amount of money, X, Y, and Z, than what you're currently making. All you have to do is show up for my job interview and you'll get hired. Now, of course, Robert said, wow, that sounds pretty awesome. I'm going to be making twice as much money than what I'm currently making. Hell, I'm down for it, John. Let's go over to your house tonight so I can get the job. John says, all right. So Robert ended up calling his mother, which little did he know that this would be the last time that he would talk to his own mom. He told his mom and said, Mom, there's one of my customers offered me a job opportunity. I'll be home late. Elizabeth, which was Robert's mother, said, all right, no problem, honey. Well, I'll see you tonight. Good luck, okay? I love you. It wasn't until a couple hours later, there was not a track of Robert within sight. Elizabeth, worrying about her son, ended up putting a missing persons report, and investigators ended up trying to find who this man was. Now, all of a sudden, coincidentally, a couple weeks after that incident, Robert was, it wasn't until John was caught in his black Oldsmobile, and John was smoking marijuana. So the policemen thought that he was smoking marijuana, and then it ended up opening up doors and realizing, hey, we finally also not only found a marijuana smoker, but we just got finished finding a guy that killed 33 people. Now, the police investigators, after being told from John where he lived, they ended up going into the house, started seeing these decomposing bodies that were unidentified, and also the only thing that was being identified was the teeth. So forensic analysis, we're only able to identify the decomposed body by the teeth, and the bodies were sent home to their family, sadly, and that's how John was caught. And John was sentenced to life in prison. However, he was executed in 1994, and his last words were, "Kiss my ass." I kind of wonder if this guy's in hell, which I'm sure he is, because this guy has no remorse for what he did. Kind of creepy. I also want to show you a picture. This is actually a picture of him, of his mugshot, And this is also a picture of him dressed up as a clown, and this is like usually where he would show up to children's birthday parties. Again, it's scary because you don't know who you're meeting out there. So, getting into the story, the next story I'm going to be talking to you is the Ronald DeFeo Jr. murders, also known as the Amityville Horror. Now, on November 13th, 1974, this murdering happened. Now, before I begin this murder, Ronald had a big family, and they had moved into this house on 112 Ocean Drive. And his father was a car salesman. Also, that's how Ronald got the job, because he would work with his father. Now, Ronald didn't have a good relationship with his father because his father was also very abusive towards him. There were times where he would threaten him with a gun, call him all sorts of names, kind of, again, downplay that whole "you're a crappy son, shut the hell up, get the hell out of my face" type of mood. So, correlating this was said to have caused Ronald to commit the murders, which on November 13th, 1974, Ronald came in one night at 3:15 in the morning, went upstairs to his parents' bedroom, and shot his father in the back 2 times after that. 2 times. Shot his mother once. Sadly, he would kill his whole family and brothers and sisters between the ages of 18 to 9 years old. It wasn't until after that Ronald ended up trying to disguise the murders by cleaning himself up, taking a shower, cleaning up all the blood that was there, but leaving the bodies. So after that, he ended up going to work the next day, pretending that nothing happened, and he kept insisting, "I've tried to reach my family, nobody's answering. I tried to reach my family, nobody's answering." So after that, he ended up hanging out with friends at night and said the same thing, "I've tried to reach my family, nobody's answering." So then he went to a bar, which he usually go, where he knew people, and he ended up screaming at the top of his lungs, "They murdered my family, somebody murdered my family." So this freaking his friends out, they ended up following Robert to the house, and the friends were at a sight for their lives. They called the police, investigators came, and started noticing that in each individual room, the bodies were laid face down on their bellies. The question is why they were laid face down on their bellies. Nobody really knows. Some claim that it was, of course, Ronald disguising the crime scene by rolling the bodies over to kind of hide the evidence on how they were shot or killed. Who knows? But however, the investigators at that time didn't know that it was Ronald, because they see this guy coming up to them calling the cops, and of course, according to Ronald, he was at work and hanging out with his friends the whole day. But the story didn't really add up, because they were able to put 2 and 2 together, and they said, wait a minute, this murder, by the decomposition of these bodies, happened at a very earlier time. So this had to have been on this date. So Ronald ended up lying and saying that it was a mafia hitman that killed his family, and then it started saying that his mother and sister killed the family, but ended up, all the lies started catching up with Ronald, and Ronald ended up confessing, saying that I just couldn't stop. I just had to kill, and the demonic voices told me to do it. Now, of course, Ronald was sentenced to 25 years of life in prison, where he died in 2021 at the age of 69. A year after this murder happened back in 1974, around 1975, there was another family that had purchased the house. Now, the family that purchased the house bought the house at a very low price because of the murders that had happened, and they were discussed by the realtor, and they said, okay, we're trying to sell you this house, so we want to make sure that you guys know what you're signing up for. Do you have a problem living in a house where there was a murder a year ago that happened? The Lutz family said, yeah, no problem, we'll still buy the house. I mean, it's still a nice house. What's the worst that can happen? It might have a bloody history, but it looks like a normal house. So the Lutz family and the realtor shook hands, and the Lutz family purchased the house in 1975. After they purchased the house in 1975, of course, it wasn't until weird stuff started happening by one of the stepfathers by the name of George. Now, George was said to wake up in the middle of the night for some reason at the exact time at 3:15 in the morning, around the time that Ronald DeFeo committed the murder with his whole family. And George would say, man, why am I waking up every night at 3:15 in the morning? This is so strange. I've never had this happen before. There is also reports of strange odors that were in the house, like something dead or something sulfur. There was even green slime oozing out of the walls and keyholes. There was even experience of cold spots in the house. And it got to the point where they ended up grabbing a priest. Now, there was a priest that blessed the house and started saging until he went into this one particular room. As the priest went into this one particular room, he hears a voice as he's doing the exorcism in the room. Get out! This freaked the priest so much to where he started clearing the room up as best as he can, and he left the room and advised the Lutz family to never stay in that room and to keep that door closed forever, because it's bad energy there and it's very demonic. So the Lutz family agreed, and other paranormal activities started happening. There was even reports of a nearby garage door in the house opening and closing. There was even an invisible spirit knocking a knife down. Stuff would fall, pictures would fall. And of course, there was even a witness from George and his son Daniel. When they were sleeping in the house, they felt a presence outside of the room, and they looked outside the window, and there was a creature with there was a creature with a pig-like face with red eyes staring down at George and his son Daniel. There was even times where George and his wife would wake up in the middle of the night and they would be levitating over the bed for an unexplainable reason. Even the kids would also experience it. They would be levitating off the floor with their beds for no unexplained reason. There was even a time where there was a priest that got blisters all over his hands for no particular reason. It was such a very well demonic house with a lot of activity, and it inspired the movie to be created, and of course a book to be produced, which I believe was the Lutz family, I believe, that wrote the book with their experiences. Now, this story was interesting because people were very skeptical at that time, as usual, because when they hear all these stories, they think, oh, it's just them trying to get attention. No, there was even evidence that they did a lie detector test and they passed. They were telling the truth, that there was experiences that were happening. So after that, they ended up moving out, and then there was like another family that ended up taking the house, but the family didn't really last long and they ended up moving. So, but I want to show you guys a very interesting photo though, because this was around 1976. This was about 2 years after the murders happened. There was an investigation crew that was going on, and they were so fascinated by the reports of this house that they ended up grabbing a couple by the name of Ed and Lorraine Warren, two paranormal and psychic investigators. When they went into the house, they felt a lot of energy there, and they grabbed this infrared camera that would automatically take pictures if there was something that was standing in front of it. As you look in this picture, according to the Warrens, there was nobody in the house at that time. They caught the picture of this little boy that's staring right into the camera with these glassy eyes. If you notice the resemblance of this little boy at the end of the staircase, there's also an image of the boy, which was Ronald DeFeo's little brother, John DeFeo, who was killed at 9 years old at the time. Now look at the resemblance of the faces. This looks like John, and look at the little boy that's in the picture, and there was nobody in the house. And I remember I remember seeing this picture actually when I was like 6 or 7 years old, because at that time there was a site, if you guys remember, called ghoststudy.com. This was before you had YouTube, and I would usually go on there on Friday nights with my older brother, and it was basically like a web page, because back then it was mostly web pages in the early 2000s. And I remember seeing this particular picture, and they would have multiple pictures on there. I'll have to do an episode on that, but I'll never forget, this picture is one of the most famous pictures ever caught, and there's no explanation for it. So my question is do you believe that this picture is real, or do you believe that this picture is fake? If you believe that this picture is fake, look at the resemblance in this picture. This picture, there was nobody in the house, at least it was claimed to be, and it looks just like this little boy, John DeFeo. There's a resemblance. The next story that I'm going to be talking to you about is going to be called the Greenbrier Ghost. Now this story is going to send you chills up your spine, because this story is about somebody that died and they're communicating beyond the grave. So it wasn't until the winter of 1897 in Greenbrier County in West Virginia, there was a mother by the name of Mary Jane Hester. Now, Mary Jane was claimed to be visited by her dead daughter. Now, her daughter was named Elva Zone Hester Shue, who had passed away. Now, of course, Elva, of course, was married to a very good-looking guy, and of course, she died suddenly at a very young age, which was said to be a heart attack. But Mary had a feeling that there was more to the story, but she started becoming very in denial about the story. It wasn't until after her daughter was killed, she thought that was very strange that she died very suddenly, because the husband that Elva was married to ended up preparing her body for burial. Now, it was kind of strange, because Mary says, wait a minute, my daughter just died. Why is her husband preparing her dress behind my back, which in fact that it should be me and my other daughter, because in those days it was a tradition, a mother preparing a body of their dead daughter. It was a woman's thing, right? So it wasn't until she went into, they had the funeral happening, and she went into the funeral morgue, and she noticed there was something off about the body. So of course, being in the room with her daughter, she ended up taking a rag that was off of her dead daughter's body's neck, and she ended up dropping the rag on the floor by accident and also spilling water on it, which turned into blood. Knowing that this was strange, she said, wow, I'm seeing blood. What type of wound does she have? Of course, in those days, women wore high neck collars as their everyday clothing, so Mary ended up pulling the collar back and ended up noticing that her throat was choked to death and that her windpipe was smashed. Now, of course, the interesting thing about this story was at the time that her daughter was dead, the husband of her daughter ended up denying an autopsy, basically saying that she died of a heart attack. Now, the interesting thing about that is Elva started getting in. Mary started getting very in denial. Okay, wow, could my son-in-law have murdered my daughter? I don't know. He seems like a very nice guy. It can't be him. It can't be him. So Mary started getting very in denial until one particular night, she ended up seeing a surprise fright of her life. She wakes up in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden, she sees at the foot of the bed her daughter at the foot of the bed, Elva. Now, Elva, according to Mary, looks at her daughter, and the daughter starts telling her what happened, that there was a fuss over dinner, and that her husband ended up strangling her, started hitting her, abusing her, and actually broke her neck, and that's how she died. Now, the interesting thing about that is this allowed Mary to tell investigators at the time, hey, I was just visited by my daughter, and my daughter claimed that my son-in-law murdered her. Now, of course, investigators thinking, you're BS, and Mary said, no, there's literally like marks on her neck. Her windpipe is smashed. So it wasn't until they redid a re-examination on Elva's body, and they noticed from autopsy individuals, they noticed that her windpipe was smashed, her neck was separated from her spine due to it being badly broken, and it wasn't until Elva's husband was put in prison because of that incident, and it was said that on July 11th of that year, Edward was found guilty of murdering Elva and sentenced to life in prison, and he died 3 years later from an unknown illness. Now, of course, he's buried in an unmarked grave. Now, here's a question about this. It's interesting because a murder happened. You have a claim from a mother that her daughter is reaching out to her from beyond the grave, saying that her son-in-law murdered, starting telling the detailing of the story to her mother at the foot of her bed, and the mother ended up taking her word for it and is saying, wow, my daughter just got finished communicating to me from beyond the grave. This guy is guilty, and he was the one that murdered my daughter. Coincidence? He was put in prison. If you go into the area in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, there's a sign called the Greenbrier Ghost, and it tells you all about it. That it's probably one of the first cases ever documented that's claimed to have been solved by a dead person who was a victim of that crime. Ghosts communicate beyond the grave. I'm telling you, there's a lot of things out there that we cannot explain that we try to explain. The next story that I'm going to be talking to you is King Henry VIII. Now, a lot of us know who King Henry VIII is. He was the King of England for 36 years. And he was a very famous guy because he ended up forming a Protestant Reformation, started dividing the churches. Now, he was also known to have been married. He was the king of England from 1509 to 1507. He was married to at least 6 different women. Now, 2 of them were annulled, 2 of them died from natural deaths, and a couple of them after that were beheaded due to adultery and treason. Now, the ghosts that are said to be haunting, because King Henry VIII died in 1547 from complications of his health, because he had severe gout at that time. The spirit of King Henry VIII is said to have been witnessed on a number of occasions, wandering the halls and corridors of the Hampton Court Castle. This is a picture of the Hampton Court Castle, where King Henry VIII was said to stay. And guests that have stayed at the castle, because guests are able to sleep over in the castle, they have said to have heard footsteps of the king and hearing his moans and groans and him yelling, which is said to be him probably yelling at his wives, because he was a very abusive man, from what it was said. And they took the vibe of him being a very large and aggressive man when he was alive. Now, this is also known. Now, I'm going to show you a creepy ghost photo that is said to be King Henry VIII, because this was taken on December of 2003 through a CCTV computer a CCTV computer monitor. Now, there are reports of security guards late at night seeing the doors opening and closing repetitively with nobody there. And it wasn't until that a couple days after this would happen, they would catch something that was very frightening. Now, if you look in this photo right here, as the doors were opening, doing their usual thing mysteriously, they caught an image of a man wearing a robe actually standing by the doors. Now, as the doors are closing and opening back up, the figure is gone. Could this be King Henry VIII? Who knows? This is known as the Skelter. Now, it wasn't just a security staff who spotted it. It was a visitor who have claimed to have spotted this specter of a large man near the same doors. This could be King Henry VIII. Now, into the Hampton Court place. This was around the marriage where he was married to Queen Catherine, who had an affair with a guy by the name of Thomas Culpeper and Frances Dereham. Now, of course, she was engaged to these guys very previously behind King Henry VIII's back, while King Henry VIII was doing his own thing, being king somewhere else. And it wasn't until Queen Catherine was having an affair and a relationship with these guys. Now, of course, there was a witness that ended up spying on Catherine, and of course, it was proven that Catherine was having an affair, and King Henry VIII got extremely fussed and upset about it, that Catherine was sentenced to death for adultery and treason for cheating on her husband. So, of course, it was until February 13th, 1542, that the 2 men that Queen Catherine had an affair with, Culpeper and Dereham, they were both executed, and Catherine too was beheaded, February 13th, 1542. Now, it is said that Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of King Henry, is said to roam the palace to this day, and visitors and staff have both reported hearing screams, which back in those days, this was said to have been Queen Catherine being taken by her hair to be beheaded, and they believe that the screams that are heard from Queen Catherine are actually screams of Catherine not wanting to be beheaded and being scared of death. Now, people report hearing noises and the feeling of somebody being dragged, and sad voices, and of course the feeling of feeling sad. So, after hearing all this story, you kind of wonder, do you want to take a visit to the former castle of King Henry VIII, the Hampton Court Skelter? You'll have to check it. It's up in England, and I'm sure you can get a good stay for a night. And maybe feel King Henry VIII's ghost, along with the large screams that are also said to be heard from his wives. Alright everybody, thank you for watching my channel today. Please like and subscribe, and hopefully you guys have a very wonderful day. This channel is going to be a very interesting channel, I promise you. If you guys want to leave a comment on this section, I would like to hear your guys' favorite places to visit that are haunted, or if you guys ever had any ghost experiences. If you guys have had any ghost experiences, please leave a comment below. I'll reply to it, because I would love to hear it, because this stuff is so interesting to read about. You guys have a wonderful day. Subscribe. See you later.